Welcome to lecture number 11. Today we'll explore several events associated with the early Cold War in the years following World War II, from about 1945 to 1961. There are three primary areas to be investigated in this lecture. First, we'll explore a series of policies adopted by the United States in the early years of the Cold War. Secondly, the lecture will trace the evolution of anti-communism in the United States, which involved the rise of Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. Finally, the domestic policies adopted during the administrations of both Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower will be studied. This slide provides images of the two presidents who were in office during this time period. On the left, we see Harry Truman, who was president from 1945 to 1953. On the right, we see Dwight Eisenhower, whose administration was in place from 1953 to 1961. Their views had a lot of influence over U.S. policies during this era. The context of the Cold War begins with the mutual mistrust between the Americans and Soviet Union. In some ways, this mistrust was apparent before and even during the Second World War. Here we see a photograph of the Big Three taken during the Second World War in February of 1945, shortly before the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Unfortunately, the alliance which had united these nations began to crumble after the war. The time period associated with the Cold War is from 1947 to 1989, and it primarily involved the United States and its allies versus the Soviet Union and its allies. The reason why it's called a Cold War is that for the most part it was a war of words, a war of ideologies, rather than guns. However, at times it did become hot, so to speak. Essentially, the alliance between the Americans and the Soviets was only a temporary one. Once that common enemy of Germany was gone, the alliance became a thing of the past. There was a great deal of mutual mistrust between the Americans and Soviets on several different levels. Americans mistrusted communism in general because it involved a violent revolution and often curtailed civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Toward that end, the Americans didn't even recognize the communist government in Russia until it had been in place for over 10 years. The Soviets were angered at this lack of recognition, but even more important was the lack of a second front during the Second World War until 1944. In the meantime, millions of Russians died as Stalin's country bore the brunt of Germany's advances during the war. Another area of conflict was shown with events associated with Poland. In many ways, Poland was seen as a symbol of the Second World War, because Hitler's invasion in September of 1939 sparked the involvement of Western nations in the war. At the end of the war, the Soviet Union never allowed free elections to take place, even though they had promised to do so at Yalta. Instead, Stalin wanted a buffer in Eastern Europe to prevent another invasion in the future. The Americans and other allies were not allowed any involvement in a post-war Poland. Stalin countered. He pointed out that the United States denied the Soviets any influence over the reconstruction of Japan. So the bottom line here is that there's a series of conflicting views by the Americans and Soviets as to what should happen with different parts of the post-war world. The reality of events in Eastern Europe came to the forefront when Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946. He argued that an Iron Curtain had spread across Eastern Europe and called for an alliance of all English-speaking people to stop Soviet aggression. This map identifies the Iron Curtain as described by Winston Churchill. From Poland and East Germany in the north to Bulgaria in the south, we see a sphere of influence designed to provide a buffer to protect the Soviet Union from invasion. During the Cold War, American policies were underwritten by a philosophy developed in the years shortly following World War II. The philosophy I'd like to discuss would be containment. This was developed by a member of the State Department who was an expert in Russian history. His name was George F. Kennan. He argued a variety of things. First of all, he declared that the United States could do nothing about removing the Soviets from areas already under their control. Once again, here's that map of Cold War Europe. The area which is circled on the map identifies the regions controlled by the Soviet Union. there was nothing the U.S. could do to remove Russian forces from these regions. While there was nothing the Americans could do about areas the Soviets already controlled, history told Kennan that the Soviets were expansionistic by nature, so his second point was that the Americans had to contain any and all future expansion by the Soviet Union. His third point was how this would be done. First, he called for negotiations, then maybe economic sanctions. Force was only to be used as a last resort. This was important because containment became the foundation of American foreign policy throughout the entire Cold War. Once the philosophy of containment was adopted in 1947, the United States began to implement different Cold War policies. I'd like to talk about two next. The philosophy of containment was first seen with the Truman Doctrine. I'd like to begin with some background. Following World War II, the economies of several European nations floundered, and some turned to communism as a possible alternative. This was particularly true in Greece and Turkey, as they were fighting against communist-supported insurgents in their countries. The fear was that if Greece and Turkey fell, it would open the door to the expansion of communism into Western Europe and the Middle East. Truman decided to act quickly, and he asked for support when he addressed a joint session of Congress in March of 1947. The new policy was accepted by Congress, and it came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. First of all, the United States promised $400 million in military aid to both Greece and Turkey. Secondly, it pledged American support for free people fighting against oppression and subjugation everywhere. This was important because it essentially dictated that American forces would become a global police force in the fight against communism. Greece and Turkey were covered by the Truman Doctrine. However, the economies of several other European nations continued to struggle by 1948. Overall, the Americans wanted to provide humanitarian aid to people who really were suffering. They also wanted to fight communism. Economic aid to Europe was seen as an additional weapon to fight against the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan was named for the U.S. Secretary of State George Catlett Marshall, and it was announced by Marshall in 1948. The United States gave, this wasn't a loan, it gave $17 billion in aid to Western European nations. Several countries participated in the program. The impact of the Marshall Plan was overwhelming and an incredible success. First of all, it resulted in the economic recovery of all of Western Europe. As their economies prospered, support for communism as a radical alternative waned, so this was successful in helping to stop the spread of communism. And, not by accident, it also helped the American economy as U.S. businesses traded goods with a prosperous Europe. A crisis involving Germany and the city of Berlin raised tensions between the Americans and Soviets. Following the Second World War, Germany was occupied by the Americans, British, French, and the Soviets. The city of Berlin was also divided, however, it was located in the Soviet zone. Once again, here we have that Cold War map of Europe. Located within the circle would be the country of Germany. The arrow is pointing to the city of Berlin, located in the eastern half of the country, and that was occupied by Soviet troops because that was in the Soviet zone. Here is a close-up of the city of Berlin. Most of the citizens within Berlin supported the Western democracies as opposed to the Soviet Union. Well, in response to the policies adopted by the United States in the late 1940s, in June of 1948, Stalin established a blockade of the city of Berlin. All rail lines and highways to and from the city were closed down. This effectively isolated these people from the rest of Germany. Questions were raised. Would the United States act to help? If so, what would be done? Would this confrontation lead to another full-fledged war with the Soviets? The United States responded, not with force, but with what came to be known as the Berlin Airlift. For almost 1 year, American planes brought food and other items to people living in the city of Berlin.